Hello, everyone, and thank you again for joining us today. I have a request. If you value the show, the series, the wisdom, and inspiration, and if you view me as your confidant, as some of you have shared with me, I need you to do me a small favor. What I would love you to do is to go to Spotify and Apple Podcasts, search for Diversity Connects Us, and leave us a review and feedback. This keeps our audience engaged. This way, I know what topics you enjoy so that I could bring more of that conversation to you. I have something else for you. By supporting my work, I would love you to go to Amazon. The title of my book is Emotional Intelligence, a toolkit for managing diversity, equity, and inclusion. It will only cost you a cup of coffee. Today, we will be discussing Black emotional intelligence with Willie Jackson. What I would love you to do for everybody who's here in the audience, because I did send a lot of invites, so we're going to have a beautiful audience, is give him a round of applause. And you might consider how this can affect you. I see you backstage, how this can affect you, your workplace, and your personal relationships. This also illustrates the many facets of DEI and how to bridge those gaps. My name is Rochelle Carrier, and I'm an EQ coach, and I help leaders reframe their mindset through an emotionally intelligent lens through thought-provoking workshops and webinars. You can find me on LinkedIn or at hello@seqconsulting.co. Today with us is Willie Jackson. Hi, Willie. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm doing so well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so happy to have you. If you'd like to introduce yourself in your unique way to the audience.
Hey folks, Willie Jackson here, head of growth and partner at ReadySet. ReadySet's a diversity strategy firm that's trying to change the way the world works. Just honored to be a part of this conversation. I think relevant for today's conversation, I will mention that I used to run an online magazine for Black men called Abernathy, and that really informed a lot of my perspective that we'll get into today, and obviously how I show up in the world as a melanated male. So just excited to dig in and honored to be a part of today's conversation.
Me too. We had a pre-conversation before our podcast today, and I remember you saying that you had privilege. So why do you believe you have privilege, and what is your narrative? Because I think the narrative is very important for us to put us in a position of believing that we are privileged.
Yeah, I say I have privilege because it's true. And I recognize that term carries a lot of weight, a lot of charge for a lot of people. And in my work as a DEI facilitator, I'll go broad and then I'll go narrow. I do a lot of work around trying to reclaim and reframe privilege because a lot of people can feel offended or defensive at the accusation that they have privilege. A lot of people have complicated feelings around that. And one of the reasons that I really own that is in my work, I try and unpack and illustrate the way that we all can hold both marginalization and privilege within the same body and within the same identity. So, what I often say is, I hold a marginalized identity as an African American person, as a Black person in the United States, descendant of people that were enslaved, so on and so forth. I also hold tremendous privilege as an able bodied, English speaking, educated male. And so when I think about my life, the rooms I'm in, the contexts in which I'm operating, I'm very senior. I don't generally inhabit rooms where I'm being told what to do. I'm being trusted as a confidant and an advisor. I get the benefit of the doubt. And just to give you a very specific example, I don't get talked over in meetings. And so, because of the fact of my social identity, which is to say a straight, able bodied, English speaking male, male of color, I get all of the credibility in the DEI space of being a person of color, and I get all of the privilege of being a guy. And so I move through the spaces that I do with relative ease because of the fact of my identities and privileges that I didn't do anything to garner. I didn't choose this body, my background, the way I was socialized. A lot of these things are completely out of my control. So when I talk about having privilege, what I'm trying to do is get real with myself out loud in front of other people about the things that make my life easier. And I do that so people feel an invitation to do the same, so we can then use that as a superpower in, as we might say, our allyship practice. In other words, it costs me nothing if I see a woman identified colleague being talked over in a meeting or having her ideas usurped to say, yeah, I think Kim mentioned that earlier, or Jessica, were you finished? I think you were talking. Right? That doesn't cost me anything. So from that lens, I can think of my privilege as having a surplus of good things to share or to offer, such that other people can benefit from the things I have in surplus, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It's interesting how you said it doesn't cost you anything to say to Jessica or Kim or Kimberly, whichever name you mentioned, is, you know, did you finish your sentence? I think that's something that a lot of us don't do because we've prioritized ourselves in asking questions, and all those questions are simmering in our mind, and we're just waiting to ask the question as the person is talking, and we don't let the person finish speaking. And I think in part that has to do with emotional intelligence. So what would, Black emotional intelligence mean to you? Because that was really subtle, and that is self-awareness.
Love that you're pulling on these threads of subtlety. So, I mean, the way I would reflect back what you just said is we don't always see active listening practiced in our conversations. There's this choreography, there's this dance, there's this tennis match of people figuring out what they're about to say while the other person is talking. And so we're not actually listening deeply. And so when I think of active listening, I think about that as listening deeply such that the thing that we're hearing can change our mind. I used to work for a guy who would respond to the things that I said by pausing and say, that's really interesting. Let me think about that for a moment. And at first it was very disconcerting because who does that? But I really came to appreciate the thoughtfulness he put into receiving what I had to say and really considering it. You know, we're both technologists and engineers, so it became normalized. But I wanted to offer that as an example of like what active listening might look and feel like, and how you can inhabit a conversation differently. In terms of Black emotional intelligence, I mean, I have to make this about me because mine is the only perspective I have and have inhabited. What we know based on anecdotes and research in the before times in particular is that one of the things that Black men tend to do in meetings in a corporate context is to show up early and to make themselves small, right? Because of the stereotype of Black men being dangerous or just a threat generally. And many Black men have so internalized that mindset that they show up and make themselves small, or as I like to say, they dim their light. And I think that's a travesty. So a part of emotional intelligence to me, given the fact of my social identity and the color of my skin, is not just being aware of that, it's choosing to do something different. Because when I can show up, based on my experience, when I can show up with ease and joy and lightness and levity and not inhabit a space that feels constrained by the fact of my identity, it puts other people at ease as well and gives them permission to inhabit themselves more fully. So a lot of the labor required involves anticipating and understanding what you're up against, right? Those unspoken rules and norms, and then being choiceful about how you opt out of certain things. I don't feel any responsibility or need to make myself smaller. I also don't need to feel performative or to put on a show on the basis of other people's expectations or on the basis of prioritizing their comfort. But I can notice how the way I show up impacts other people, and I can choose to act one way or another on the basis of how I want to be received and how I want to see myself.
Right. Do you think you made a good point when, men enter meetings or office spaces, they tend to shrink. Do you think Black males feel isolated and misunderstood? And why do you think that is?
I can only speak for myself, but having run an online magazine for Black men and having been in community with a lot of Black men, I think feelings of isolation are fairly common and fairly universal. Notions of intimacy are really tough, particularly, and let me caveat this for straight Black men, because the notion of masculinity has gotten really confused and conflated with a lot of unproductive tropes. And so I think um, you do see a dearth of community and intimacy with straight Black men in particular. I think there's a different story playing out in queer communities. And so it's a great question. I can only speak for myself. I have been through periods of my life when I felt extremely isolated and lonely, and I didn't actually have the language at the time to be honest with myself about what I was experiencing. So working remotely is a great example of how we can feel a lot of freedom around being able to work whatever and however we'd like. Terms and conditions apply. But that isolation can be really challenging for people that, for example, live alone or don't have that connection to community, a church group, a sports league, or whatever the case may be. So I do think isolation and loneliness is a tremendous challenge that a lot of people are facing and don't feel comfortable admitting either to themselves or to others.
Do you think that's unconscious?
I think a lot of it is below the surface for sure. Um, it's not something we tend to check in with each other about. So I don't have people in my life that say, "Hey, do you feel isolated? Hey, do you feel lonely?" That's not something
Mm.
that feels normalized, at least in my social circle. But what I will say is that I wish I had people in my life when I was going through a period. I don't know, almost 10 years ago when I felt really jammed up, isolated. I was going through a period of anxiety, depression, and I was trying to work some things out in my entrepreneurial journey, and it was really challenging. I was doing some writing at the time, and I really expressed some of myself through my writing. Maybe we can include this in the show notes, but I wrote an article called From Dying to Thriving, One Black Man's Journey to Wellness. I think that's what it's called. And it just described some of the challenges that I had experienced. And I remember some of my friends reaching out to me as a result. So, if I could frame your question in terms of an invitation for people who experience that and who are listening to this, let people know that you're not doing okay in whatever way that looks. I remember what it was like for nothing to be wrong per se, but to have a lot of emotional pain, right? Something was amiss, but I didn't necessarily have the tools or the language to describe that either to myself or to others. So um, I I have a lot of empathy for people in that jam because I know all too well what that feels like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Lewis Wellington Jr., thank you so much for showing up. He says, "Thank you for doing this LinkedIn Live. I wish that more men realize that male privilege is a thing. It is the first step in beginning to empathize with a woman's viewpoint."
Thanks for saying that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting. Do you think that emotional intelligence comes into play often for Black males? And do you think that being self-aware of the way that Black males are viewed or portrayed in the media is already a point of contact that they already feel? Do you think that's something that they're already aware of before entering those workspaces? Do you think it happens often without even them realizing that it's actually happening because they don't have anybody checking in with them?
It's such a great question. I think it depends. Not everybody has the kind of mentorship, the kind of guidance that they need. I'll never forget, I hosted a dinner one time, and a gentleman, I won't mention his name, but a very senior, very influential Black man in the Bay Area came and just kind of gave us some OG wisdom. And he talked about how he knew a lot of senior executive Black men who tried to make moves based on how their white male mentors advised them, making power moves and things like that in the boardroom. And they would flame out because they can't move around in the same way. They didn't have the same kinds of privilege. And I've just never forgotten that conversation. This was many years ago. I've never forgotten that conversation because it brings into stark relief the way that we have to take in wisdom and best practices and guidance and ambition. We have to hold all these things while also being realistic with ourselves about what is possible. And I don't say that because we need to sell our dreams short, but we need to understand that the world looks different for different people on the basis of their identity, on the basis of the biases and gaps in knowledge of the people that we're dealing with, et cetera. So there's no question that we internalize to a disproportionate degree the things that we see in media, the things that we see around us, and a lot of these images are not beautiful. There it really is a dearth of representational leadership when we talk about, for example, Black men in the Fortune 500. So you could be forgiven for having an incomplete view of what it takes to be successful or to even have a smaller conception of what's possible for you because you don't necessarily see examples of what it can look like to be a leader or what it can look like to be extremely successful, or the successful images that you see, maybe musicians and entertainers, maybe those images don't feel attainable for you. Right. So I think it's tricky. I think it's a fantastic question, though.
Right. And, where does, and I know you can probably speak from experience, where do you think that leads black men? How do you see, their future, or what can they use? Okay, let's reframe it. So what have you been able to use? What resources and tools have you been able to use? And it probably goes because as I'm hearing you, I hear I hear a growth mindset as we're speaking. You don't have a fixed mindset. And what do you think that Black males should be working on from your perspective to be able to navigate the spaces of privilege the way you do?
Well, I don't think anybody should be like me. I think one is more than enough.
Right.
Um, but to be more serious, I think community has saved me for sure. I know you've had Jewel Love on your show, and what Jewel is doing around Black executive men and building that professional community, I think is profound. I think he just launched a podcast yesterday. I was doom scrolling the one I opened a few hours ago. So really excited to the work that Jewel is up to. I think that's a blackexecutivemen.com. Um, so I say that to mention two things. One is the fact of community. It's just been invaluable. Some things just work themselves out when you're around other people that are smiling and laughing and struggling. You don't even need to necessarily spill out what you're going through and what's challenging for you, although I would encourage that. But just the fact of being in community with people that remind you of yourself,
Mm.
I think that can be really powerful. Invaluable for me has been a self-care practice that includes everything from affirmations to journaling. Gratitude journaling in particular has just been absolutely incredible for me. Visioning what you want your life to be like, you got to move your body, got to get some sunshine. Hopefully you live in a place where the sun shines at least a few months out of the year. Getting in nature, even if that's a park near you, I can't tell you how much has been unwound just by me getting out in nature, touching grass, being in nature. That has been incredibly healing for me. It's one of the I'm in Brooklyn now, but that's one of the reasons I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, Oakland specifically, is because there's a particular relationship you can have with nature and the redwoods when you're in a place that is just beautiful and that doesn't like fight with nature, but preserves it and allows you to spend some time there. So connecting with fundamental humanity, which is to say community and connection, breaking bread, even if that's, grabbing an ice cream cone and walking around the block with the homies. I think it can be really powerful just to share space and time with people who don't need to be explained. Like you don't need to explain what your experience is like, but you can kind of have that shorthand. That experience is really profound and powerful for me. So those are some reminders that come top of mind for me.
Right. And in the workspace, when you're navigating the workspace as you are today, I had Donald Knight. He's been on the show twice, and he's the chief people officer. I hope I'm getting that correct, for Greenhouse. And he says he always offers up ice cream in all his meetings. And like you said, it breaks bread. It actually removes all the barriers. He brings in ice cream, or somebody else brings in ice cream, flavor of choice, and so the atmosphere, if anything was going to be toxic or negative, or any emotions that you were feeling before coming into work, it already has completely dissipated.
I love that.
Right? So when you said, go out in nature, that's basically what it is, and have ice cream, with your friends, and there are no pretenses.
Not, first of all, shout out to Donald. I met Donald in Vegas last month. Time flies.
Oh,
The
okay.
unofficial mayor of Atlanta. What a guy. I hope you all have an opportunity to meet Donald. And I love what you said about like not having the pretense, but something specific I want to point out about the communion, the community, breaking bread, and spending time with other people is it's really easy to stay and to get in your own head and to allow shame and embarrassment to jam you up. When we are not socialized to be independent creatures, like we need to be around other humans. So whatever that looks like for you, if you can get around other people, there's just something really powerful about that. And speaking from experience, when you isolate yourself, you allow a lot of bad things, like particularly if you struggle with some mental health challenges, you allow some things a foothold that would otherwise not be able to grow if you were spending time with other people. So you got to say something if you're jammed up, whatever that looks like.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what would you want the audience today to take away?
I think of Rashawn, who has a company called You Stress. Why you stressing is the tagline there. Check on your strong friend. Check on your friends. Ask people how they're doing, and then
Mm.
go beyond the doing great. How are you? Spend a little more time. How are you actually doing? Um, I can't stress enough how important it is to check on people and to understand how they are actually doing. And it may not be received easily the first time or even the second time, but if we make a practice of really demonstrating that we care for the wellness of other people, not only is the right thing to do, and not only will that come back to you, sometimes people will take you up on that invitation, and you just never know what a lifeline that can be to somebody. So check on your friends, pay attention to when patterns change. I had a friend very recently come out of a fog of depression. He had a friend, a very young friend and business partner, who passed away tragically at a very
Mm.
young age. And on this person's birthday, he said it hit him like a ton of bricks. So I noticed that he kind of fell off socially. And I would just ping him every once in a while, ping him every once in a while. And we were able to resume. And he just shared that, he was in that dark place. So, and this is not necessarily connected to how successful somebody is, because this person is quite successful by any objective measure. But that doesn't absolve us of the experience of life, the human experience. So check on your people, check on your friends.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having me. I feel like we could
Yeah.
go on and on. We have to give the people what they want. And shout out to you for doing this. I know a little bit about your story, but the fact that you're learning out loud, you're bringing on strangers to elevate a conversation about emotional intelligence. I think that's really important. I think it's a really important project. So good on you for putting something positive and important in the world.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. It's such a pleasure because it's like you said, I have many stories, not just one, but many that brought me to this point to be able to have these conversations because now I understand a little bit, the nuances and how everybody has a story and everyone
Yeah,
comes with a set of suitcases and
that's
the
right.
suitcases might be light, they might be heavy.
That's right.
So it's a process navigating, and I think we have to focus really much more on being heart centered, right? And not come into our relationships, like you said, go back, dig a little bit deeper, as opposed to, how are you? I'm great. It was like, how are you really feeling? And I think that's the ultimate question is, how are you really feeling? And it does feel a little jarring and uncomfortable at the beginning for a lot of people because it's not a question that's often asked, and it might make them feel uncomfortable, right? And it's growing, you know, in the discomfort. And I think
Right.
that's, yeah. And it's
Productive discomfort. Absolutely.
absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you for listening as we reach the top of the Diversity Connects Us hour. But before we go, I'd like you to show some love for our podcast. Leave us a review on Apple and Spotify, and to trend with us, hashtag Diversity Connects Us. Thank you so much.